Greetings, adventurers, and welcome to Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. I hope I did that right. I don't have the muscle memory that Clever has at this point. Speaking of Clever, he is off on vacation. Ironically, we switched places where I'm now house sitting, and he's in Florida enjoying the sun. He sent me pictures of himself, and he looks weird tan. I've never seen him tan before, or relaxed. It's weird. I am here to give you guys an episode. I actually get a chance to craft for once. I know, right? You know what else I get? A chair. I can move my arms because I'm not on a yoga ball and way too low for this table. When the kit is away, the Madi will play. Today we're going to be making shoes, which is something that people have been asking Clever to make for just forever, and he keeps putting it off until he can do it perfectly. Which is, he wants to make a last, and then he wants to wet form perfect, dress shoes and whatever. I'm not so picky. So behold, shoe. It is a little bit wonky, doesn't fit perfectly, but it is mine and I love it. So this is a really actually cheap and easy shoe to make, considering I have almost zero experience with anything leather crafting. I used 3 tools and I was able to put together a pretty solid shoe. So this was a really good project for me because I learned how to not only create a pattern of a foot, which is a very difficult thing to make a pattern in the first place, but work with leather and make a full thing rather than just kind of tooling a little bit here or cutting a little bit there. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna struggle for about 4 to 5 hours to make a pattern. Let's hope that my struggle makes your struggle shorter. So the first thing I did is I went upstairs, I raided Kit's closet for some socks because I'm not cutting up my own socks and he's got plenty. I would recommend getting socks closer to the actual size of the pattern that you want to get because I had to cut off the entire top of the sock by the end of it. But to get footage of it, I ended up wrapping my foot on the table, which we'll see later on has a little bit of consequences. Just a quick shout out of something to keep in mind. When you are creating a pattern for your feet, you want to use your dominant foot, which is basically the one that is bigger. We all have that one foot that's the dom foot, you know. Hashtag dominant foot. It's better to have a shoe that's just slightly too big than to have a shoe that's slightly too small. So everything that you see me doing, I'm doing it with my right foot because that is my ever so slightly bigger foot, my dominant foot. I'm glad that people know so much about my feet now. With my foot completely wrapped, I got up and I walked around a little bit and I found that it actually was a little bit tight. It wasn't completely comfortable to walk in, but I'm so used to walking with women's shoes that come together at the toe that I just kind of ignored it and continued. Once I was happy with the overall coverage, I went and cut down the middle of the foot until I basically just had 2 halves of my foot. There was that tightness that I mentioned, in the toe area mostly, but I had decided to just keep it and move forward and then go back later and add some padding to the pattern itself. Which I really shouldn't have done because I don't know anything about pattern making and I wouldn't know how to add it on. But you know, we live with the choices we make. So after I had these 2 halves, I went and I traced the bottom of my foot, which is basically just putting your foot down onto a piece of paper and then tracing it with a pen. Later on, I'll discover that tracing it with a 90-degree straight, while it seems like the right way to do it, you really should be tracing exactly where your foot touches the paper because the actual sole of a shoe, I'll show. So the actual sole of a shoe comes in to where your foot actually touches the ground. Whereas if I had just gone with the 90-degree straight down, this would basically just be a straight line and you'll end up with a really clunky shoe. Once I was happy with all the different parts, I traced the duct tape sides of my feet onto pieces of paper to make them flat. Then I traced the paper sole onto a piece of chipboard that was thicker. I'm not tracing the duct tape ones onto chipboard yet because I'm not quite sure if they're what I want. I want to make sure that they actually come together into a shoe shape, which is what I do next. I end up taping the pieces of paper to the sides of the chipboard sole so that I can bring them together and make sure that they actually line up and look like a shoe, which they don't. They don't quite match up. And I get frustrated enough that I retrace them all, I do it again, and I still don't quite get what I'm looking for, so I decide to do the whole process again and learn some lessons. So this time, when I covered my foot in duct tape, shout out to the second sock that I had to sacrifice for that, but that's a whole pair, it doesn't have to live alone now. So this time, when I went back and I redid the duct tape wrapping of my foot, I made sure to do it on the ground, keeping my overall foot and ankle area as relaxed as possible and straight up. Basically the kind of position your foot would be at if you were just standing and relaxed. I also made sure to not really wrap the bottom of my foot, but instead press the duct tape as close to the bottom of my foot as I could while still standing. That helps me mark out the area that is actually touching the ground for later on. So once I was done wrapping it, again with short strips to make sure to capture as much detail as possible and not have to deal with like long, gangly duct tape strips. There were a few that were too long and a few that I fought with before eventually they joined their brethren in the trash can. I again cut it down the middle of the foot until I got to the part where the duct tape stopped, which would be where my foot actually touched the ground. Then I cut along the edges of the duct tape, leaving me with the sole and with the two sides of the shoe. This time my pattern actually is accurate when it comes to the sides and how far they should go down before they meet the sole. Then I followed the same sort of process where I traced them onto paper, trying to make sure that to lay them as flat as possible. It can be a little bit difficult because it's taking a 3D shape and then forcing it to be a 2D shape, but we're working with a pretty loose material when it comes to the shearling, so I'm not too concerned about the pattern not being precise. Speaking of, the material that I'm going to be using for the final product of the shoe is this shearling. This is a scrap left over after I was done. They come pretty big, because it's the full pelt of like a lamb or a sheep that's tanned with the wool still on. The end result is a really soft suede on one side and a really soft wool on the other. And it's not that expensive. The entire shearling cost maybe $20. We ended up getting two to have enough material to make both shoes, but really I only cut one side from the second shearling. So you have plenty left over for another project. I mentioned how tracing my foot doesn't quite give me the pattern that I'm looking for, because in the end, it's the actual space where your foot touches the ground that matters. So while I had the leftovers of my sock that I didn't quite tape, it wasn't good enough to make a pattern out of, and I wanted to make sure that it was as neat as possible. So I used these later in the video, but I ended up using these padded inserts as part of the shoe to make sure that they were comfortable. These are cool because they let you cut it to the size that you actually want it. So what I did was I looked up my shoe size. It has it measured out in centimeters, and I just cut it to the actual size of my foot. And then I cut off the back because it's not really needed for this shoe. With that, I have kind of a pattern of what the sole should be. So I use that to trim my sole pattern to be closer to the actual shape that I want it to be. So I do the same thing with the patterns where I lay them onto paper and I trace them out, then I cut them out of paper. Then I tape them to the chipboard sole so I can test and make sure that it actually makes a shoe. This time I was relatively satisfied with it, and I trimmed some of the edges so they matched up better, but overall this is the pattern that I use to make the shoe. Since I'm happy with it, I take the paper templates of the sides and also transfer those onto chipboard. This will help me make sure that it doesn't really change when I cut it out over and over again. Speaking of cutting it out, I lay out my lovely shearling. When I trace them out, I make sure to leave about 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance so that I have the room to stitch it. Then I get to cutting it, which, as soft as it is, it's kind of difficult to cut until you learn to be more gentle with it. You more just want to score it, and then it pulls apart. It also has wool on the other side, so you want to make sure to lay it wool side down when you cut it to avoid cutting off any of the wool. It'll still shed once you cut it, but it'll shed less. Be prepared to clean up a lot of shed wool, by the way. So that leaves me with the pieces that I need to make the overall shape of the shoe. You can kind of see it looks like a shoe in pieces, but still a shoe. But the next thing I do, I decide to pull out this 12-ounce shoe leather for the sole. And the tone of my voice right now tells you what comes next. So I laid my pattern down and traced it out, leaving the 1/4 inch seam allowance so that I can stitch it later. And then I struggled for 20 to 30 minutes to cut it out. So not only is this 12-ounce leather, this is toughened shoe leather specific 12-ounce leather. It isn't going down without a fight. It's called sole bend, and I understand that because it definitely bent my sole to its limits to finish cutting that out. But finally I am done, and I have my soles as victory tokens, and I'm ready to continue making the shoe. So for the next part, I'm actually going to take my little sole inserts, as well as the shearling that I cut out for the sole, and I'm going to lay them all out. So the thought is I'm going to use some barge cement to glue not only the sole insert, to the sole itself, but then the shearling on top of it with the wool facing upward. This is basically going to create the sole with everything I need to stitch it together later, comfortably all stuck together so it's not going to be slip sliding around when I'm walking. Now for contact adhesive, which you've probably seen Clever use in the other videos, but I'll explain it again because there might be people who come just for me. For contact adhesive, make sure you're in a well-ventilated area. It can be a little bit toxic and you want to be able to breathe easy. You know what else helps me breathe easy? Today's sponsor, Fume. Now we've had Fume on our channel quite a few times, and it's for a reason. If you don't know what it is, it's a flavored air device that uses these little cores to flavor the air as you breathe through it. So this is my first time actually getting to try one of these. I've seen Clever use it in different ads before, and let me tell you, it's not as strong as I thought it would be, but if anything, it just makes it more satisfying. It's really satisfying to just kind of sit and breathe through the different flavors and also like play with the little clicky. I get what he says when he says the clickies is fun. It comes with different flavors. The two most popular are like mint and then like orange vanilla. I like both of them. They both have kind of like this lingering flavor in the back of your like nose and mouth. The mint being more like a menthol. The orange vanilla being like, I don't know, like those aromatic herbs that you use to like brew mulled wine with. I like it best breathing through the nose and mouth at the same time because then you get like scent in and out. And even just kind of having it around makes the air smell better. So yeah, I totally get why Clever likes these so much. And he has two at this point. I might steal one. The actual device itself is like award-winning, and at this point they've served over like 300,000 customers. One step closer to making the world smell better. If you want to try one for yourself, Fume has a limited time offer for our community. For a limited time, use the code SKILLTREE to get a free base when you order the Journey Pack. It's new in the little magnetic stand. Look it. It makes it even more fun to play with. You have to be gentle so you don't knock it off. That's actually really fun.
It is, right?
Yeah. Sorry, ad. So head to tryfume.com. That's tryfum.com. And use the code SKILLTREE, all one word. Or scan the QR code on screen and get this free base with a Journey Pack today. Oh yeah, I'm definitely stealing one of these. If you do have one of these, in the comments below, tell me what your favorite flavor is. I need to know which ones to steal. Anyway, do you want to lay out a thin layer onto both of the things that you want to stick? Then you want to leave it to dry until it's tacky, where it's a little bit sticky, but it doesn't follow your finger when you pull it up. Then you very carefully, because when it touches, it is permanent, you press the two pieces together. So I basically did this for the entire bottom of the insoles and where they meet the sole itself. And I did the sole with the flesh part facing upward, which can leave the smooth finished part of the leather for the bottom of the shoe. While the sole and the insole are drying, I go ahead and I lay down some contact adhesive just on the edges of the shearling that I cut out for the sole. By the time I'm done with that, the contact adhesive on the bottom of the insole and the leather sole are pretty much ready, so I stick them together. Then I go back and trace the edges with contact adhesive to then press the shearling and the sole together. And with that, you pretty much have your sole finished. So basically, from here out, it's really simple. The only thing left to do is punch holes and stitch it together. I also end up dyeing it and sticking rubber to the bottom, but that's not necessary. So for my shoe, I want the top here around the ankle to be open. Here, let me unfold it so you can see exactly what the pattern became. So the first shoe, when I went to go punch the holes through, I ended up laying them together and then punching the holes through. Because of the wool between them and because of how like that messes with them pressing together cleanly, it made a lot of the holes, especially on the bottom part of it, uneven and wonky. So for the second one, I go back and I punch them individually, thinking that as long as I start them in the same place, the hole punches themselves are a set distance apart, so they'll mostly line up. Again, it's a very stretchy and kind of loose material, so I'm not super concerned with them being perfect. And overall, it pretty much works out. So altogether, I punch down the front of the shoe, leaving around like where it starts to become the ankle free. I punch all the way along the bottom, and then I punch all the way along the top. This will make it so that I can sew up the heel all the way into my ankle, I can sew it to the sole, and I can sew up the toe and to the front of the shoe to where it opens up. It's very difficult to show because I use black thread on black shearling, and sewing is already difficult to catch on camera. But basically, I used a saddle stitch just for the entirety of the project, and it was very simple of just continuing down the line until I got to the end. I did a back stitch and then I cut it and then I burned the thread. If you want to learn how to do a saddle stitch, we've done an entire video covering all the different types of leather stitching right here. The saddle stitch is my favorite because it's relatively simple. It does annoy some people simply because it has to have 2 needles that you bring together, but it's a really strong stitch, so I thought it would do well on a shoe. So once I had sewn the heel and the front of the shoe, I came back to my now thicker than 12-inch sole and decided to try to punch holes through it, which was a struggle. I'm not gonna lie. I thought I had defeated this piece of leather, but it had news for me. So none of the punches that Clever have are actually thick enough to get through the 12-ounce leather. That is until I found this 2-hole punch. Because it was only 2, all the force going through those 2-hole punches were enough to get through both the 12-ounce and the shearling. So I just had to basically punch each hole out individually because I had to line up one of the hole punches with the previous one and punch a new hole, which took a while, and my hand hurt a lot by the end of it, but look at my shoe! That looks like a shoe so far. Oh, I forgot to mention, I take an edge groover and I set it to 1/4 of an inch because that was my seam allowance earlier. Then I go through and I mark the bottom of the sole with the edge groover, which basically just cuts a little groove into the sole itself at the measurements that I set it, which was 1/4. This lets me line up my hole punches so that they're all pretty much the exact length away from the edge of the leather that I need them to be. Then all I had to do really was take the tops of my shoes, which are all sewn together except for the bottom, and saddle stitch along the bottom until it's pretty much a shoe. You'll notice that the toe of my shoe pokes forward more than the sole itself. And going back and trying it on, it's also a little bit loose around the heel, and basically it's just a little bit big. I think that's just because I was a little bit paranoid with the pattern itself and I didn't want to make it too small. Mostly because it's usually a better idea to make things bigger and then cut them smaller to size than to make them too small because you can't add material back on. So later on, I might go back in and hem it, basically just pinch it to where it meets my foot better, and then mark that and re-punch some holes and re-stitch the leather, the shearling itself, which honestly, that was probably the shortest of the sewing. It maybe took me like 20 minutes, so that won't be that difficult. But then since it's a leather and also wool on the inside, I'd rather it be tight than loose because the wool will compress over time and the leather will stretch. I'd want to give it space where it still fits me before it stretches out of usefulness. But yeah, once I finish sewing the bottom, you have a shoe. It's a rough shoe, but it's mine and I love it. They're also super soft. But we are not done. You can stop there and you will have a fully functional shoe. But I am clumsy enough, so I'd rather add this tread to the bottom so that I don't slip and die. Especially if I'm going to use this on like smooth flooring or even grass. I want something to grip. So to add the sole, I ordered this basically flat mat of shoe sole from Amazon, and I just laid it down, roughly cut it out, and used contact adhesive to stick it together, which is the same process as before, where you put it on both sides, you let it dry until it's tacky, and then you press it down. Because it's such a wide area and there's so much cushion between me and the thing I'm pressing it into, I opted to use a mallet. The leather on top is soft enough that it's not really going to get damaged or marred by it, and I really wanted that tread to stay. Also, it's fun to hit things with a hammer. You'll notice that this contact adhesive is a little bit gummy compared to the one I used earlier, which was more liquidy. That's because it doesn't seem like I can do a project without some form of Clever's adhesive going wrong. So I ran out of the first contact adhesive and I ended up using another one that he had that might be close to the end of its lifetime. It tends to get more gummy and more kind of like milky looking the older it gets before it eventually just kind of stops working. But it's still within its lifetime, so I suffered through and just pasted it on as best as possible. Better that than going to the store and getting more. From there, all that's left is really trimming the edges, which I did through a mixture of processes. I first cut them smaller, and then I used a file and sandpaper to try to smooth the edges together as much as possible. With that, the final step is really I just trimmed the wool from the bottom of the shoe to try to make it so that it doesn't collect water and dirt and stuff when I'm walking. And there you have it! These are my little shoes. They look like little elf shoes with the top folding down and the toe coming to a little point. I'll definitely have to hem them so they fit a bit better, but man, this project was surprisingly easy considering that I don't have any experience and taught me a lot about making patterns and working with leather. And it's simple in its process where most of it is like cutting stuff out and then sewing it together. So yeah, I can see that being a pretty good starter project to teach you about pattern making. It's not super expensive and you don't use a lot of tools. I would get a thinner leather for the sole and just make some indoor slippers, but I definitely feel more confident going forward, and I'm excited to try whenever I get the chance to making some like fully fledged shoes. I'm really happy with these considering like how little experience I have and how good these came out, and also how soft and wonderful they are. I have shoes. I've officially done something clever hasn't. They grip well, they're comfortable. The only thing I can nitpick about them is that they're a little bit loose, which I can fix so easily. That's pretty much it. So tell me what you thought of this project. I don't have the experience that Clever did, so I would greatly appreciate any sort of tips or tricks that you would have for making them better in the future, or for moving on to more complicated shoes. If you did like the project, make sure to like and subscribe and add different comments and stuff. I would love it if my videos did better than Clever's. It gives me an excuse to come up here more often and actually craft stuff instead of just sitting in my little cave and editing stuff together. Maybe we can make him do some editing every once in a while. Alright, that's pretty much it for me. I'll see you next time that I managed to make it into the workshop and make something myself. In the meantime though, keep leveling up you. I'm gonna go this way. I don't feel like getting up.